This week on The Wheelhouse. Kids. The presidential election. And how to talk to them about it. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. This year, we'll head to the polls and vote for the next president of the United States. Election years can sometimes feel like emotional roller coasters. There's the heated debates, the flood of campaign emails, texts, ads, plus nonstop coverage on cable news. It can be a confusing and overwhelming time, and that's just for us adults. There's a good chance our kids are also feeling the same way, and they likely have some questions. Today on The Wheelhouse, how to talk to your kids about politics. And we asked our listeners to send some of the tricky questions their children have sent them and ask them about the upcoming election. We're going to dive into some of those later on in the show. Joining me this morning, Dr. Christia Spears-Brown, Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence and Professor of Psychology at the University of Kentucky. Welcome to the show, Christia.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Also with us, Dr. Deborah Rivas-Drake, Professor of Education and Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Deborah.
Thank you.
And Dr. Rakesha L. Fry-Brown, co-founder and executive director of the African American Honors Collective and adjunct professor at Clark Atlanta University. Rakesha, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
For starters, Christia, when should we start engaging children on politics? Like, at what age should we start talking about this stuff with the kids?
Well, I think we have to think broadly about what we mean by politics. So when we think about should we help our communities, that's really part of politics as well. And that can start really as early as we start talking to children. So we have to kind of think broadly about what that means, whether it be taking kids with us when we go to vote, whether it be civic engagement, so helping out our communities, that's also part. And that can be when they're very, very young.
Kids aren't asking you about politics or the election. Does that necessarily mean that they're not thinking about it?
No, I think, what we've seen in our research is that kids are paying attention to it probably much younger than parents are aware. So by the time kids are in kindergarten, they're really aware of what's going on in kind of some basic ways. But just because they're not talking about it doesn't mean that they're not hearing about it at school. They're not overhearing it on the radio. They're not overhearing their parents talk about it in the kitchen. And so those little scraps of information kids are absorbing. And so, we always encourage parents to talk about it really earlier than they think they might want to, but in really kind of basic, simple, easy to understand ways.
Rakesha, how exactly should we define or describe politics for kids? Kind of similar to what Christia gave us there, but it's kind of a big idea that covers a lot of ground. So where would you start?
I think we can start by engaging children in things that they are interested in and making those connections. So as Christia discussed, helping people and being effective in the community. And so talking about how the things that children are already engaged in may play a role in the through line of politics can be a good way to start to show kids how they are connected to the political structure.
And how could we make it accessible to them, especially if they're on the younger side?
I think we have to just kind of make it simple. We know that it is a very deep process and heavily ingrained in American society, but we don't have to make everything be hard. So when we're talking to kids, we have to bring it to their level and answer the questions that they ask and really pay attention to the interest that they have. So if a child is showing interest in a conversation, follow it through, continue to have the conversation, answer the questions. But once they're done talking about it, let it be done until they bring it back up. I think when we start to beat people over the head, particularly children, with information that they're not ready to process, we lose them early in the process.
Deborah, I'll bring you in here. How important is it for children to understand civic engagement? What kind of impact does it have on a child to understand that someday their vote will matter?
Well, it's very important. And as my co-panelists have already said, civic engagement is not just voting. That's usually the behavior that a lot of folks will pay attention to, especially during an election cycle. But when we're talking about kids, we're really talking about their contributions to their communities. And community starts with, your home. Your home is a community. Your school is a community that you're a part of, and of course, your neighborhood. And so it's really important from these early conversations all the way through before they can vote, to help them understand what is their role and responsibility to shape and take care of others in their communities, including all these different levels, right? Your family, your school, your classroom, et cetera. And then also, what responsibility they have, for them, for those community members, and what is their responsibility as a community member to be making positive contributions. And I think it is important because they're learning about, how to use their voice in shaping, right, the rules, or understanding the rules of communities, or understanding the roles and responsibilities and relationships in different communities. And that's a lesson that you can start from. Those are kind of an understanding you can have very young, and it carries all the way through until, they get to that age where they can enact their contributions to their communities in a lot of different ways, including voting. So it's a little bit about establishing habits of mind and habits of practice.
You say that voting is one element of civics. Can you give us some other ideas of elements of civics?
Yes, there's a lot. And so in at home, I would say, just really talking about, the rules, and sort of understanding like how rules are made, and how, can they be revised. And then there's also, in the school, I think it's a really important context to really think about, civics and themselves as a potential civic actor. So understanding school classroom policies, and are any unfair? Do they seem to be unfair? Are they unfair? To whom are they unfair? Who makes those policies and rules? How can students have a say in those, and use their voice for these different, um, you know, um, policies and practices that shape their daily life, and things like after school clubs, that address fairness and, justice and advocacy and things like that. There are different ways, that after school clubs can do that. That's another. Writing letters or emails to your, to school leaders. I've actually seen this in my own house, just thinking about who can you tell and how do you talk to an adult who's sort of responsible for the community, about a problem, and how can we get together, how can we think together about solving this problem? And all of that is civic engagement.
So those are some ways that go ahead. Yes, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, Deborah's point made me think of one example that we did, kind of a concrete example of the civic engagement is, in my family, we often take food to the food bank in our community and take cans and canned goods. And one way we talk about that is there are some people who need extra help to have food in their house, and we're fortunate that we have it. And so it's part of our job to help other people. And how we translate that has been saying, and so part of my paycheck goes to taxes, and I'm glad that my taxes can help people that also need help. So thinking about a concrete way of helping others is like with food, and the adult version of that is taxes and the tax code and the way in which we take care of others in the community. And that's something that we might be voting on. But the canned goods is the kind of child version of that more politicized kind of understanding.
I appreciate how you all are opening my eyes to politics and then beyond that, community, more importantly, and how people can engage with civics that way. So this is a very important conversation. So that's one way we were talking about it, potentially bringing folks down to the local collection agency where people are trying to support families and things like that. Deborah was talking about getting folks involved in classroom policy and things like that and talking to school leaders. What about in terms of the act of voting? Would you bring children to the polling place when you do that? Is that one thing you recommend? Is that one way to get people involved?
Yes, modeling those behaviors. If you're eligible and you're able to vote, I mean, that's an important thing that you can model. I bring my kids. We get excited about the stickers, the I voted stickers. I voted stickers for them. We make it a family activity. I go, our whole family goes down to vote together. We have done that multiple times. And that is something, it doesn't have to be kept from them. It's a part of, it's something that we do. It's one of our civic duties, and it's something that we believe it's important to do. And we show them that, and we do it as a family. And so all of that is, we know from lots of studies that show, like modeling those behaviors is really important for, young people's, their own voting behaviors in the future. But I think understanding so as they get older, I would say we started out with just, we're excited when they're like, really young, just we voted. And what does that mean? And we used our voice, right? But as they get older, we have begun to talk to them more about why we're voting in certain ways. What are the reasons for, how do we think about different candidates and what they stand for and what they have actually what their record is like, and in ways that are still right, like easy to digest and easy to understand, but still are important for them to know that we are casting a vote that is informed, right? Like we have our understanding of why we're doing it, and why we're voting the way we are. I think that's part of also what needs to be modeled.
Deborah, are you okay with me asking you this? What age then? What age was a way where you started to feel comfortable talking about how you're voting and informing, I guess, that vote?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as my kids started to move into, I would say early adolescence is a really important time, but I think you could do it even a little bit younger. It depends, on how ready, as Dr. Brown mentioned, the readiness is really important. You don't want to just throw a bunch of, dump a lot of information and it's sort of like not going. I think when they express curiosity, any age that they express curiosity about that, what is this about? Why, and so how are you voting? If they ask you, and just explaining, and your child, so how to, typically parents will know how to, do that in a way that is sensitive to what their child needs and their age and all of that. For me, I think as we started to, think more about, what the implications of the vote could mean for people in our household, or the who were even locally, kind of how local elections and school board elections and things like that, how they can actually impact our daily life in a way that's really clear to our kids. So that I would say so they're 12 now. So I would say that started maybe through 2 or 3 years ago.
10,
so
11, 12, early adolescence,
yeah,
where you're talking about middle school age. Yeah.
Yes.
So then, Christia, let's just drill down into that a little bit more then. So we're saying making sure they're ready, we're talking about early adolescence. Can you help us pinpoint that even further?
Yeah, I mean, I
Of
think
what
it's
readiness looks
also,
like, I guess, maybe?
right. And I think for my own kids, I probably started much earlier. I started really at the beginning of elementary school, but in really basic ways that I thought were related to kind of kindness to others and how I was voting in ways that I thought helped other people. But I think things to look for are, well, I see, regardless of the age, I think part of that readiness and how to talk with younger kids about it is to really focusing on the positive sides of it and not the things that might make kids scared. I think one reason we often shy away from these conversations is the political discourse among adults has become so negative and vitriolic almost, and it feels very hostile. Like this person is really bad, or this person is, really going to lead to the demise of America. Those conversations are really scary for kids. And so I think thinking about framing it positively when we're talking with young kids, whether, elementary school or middle school, thinking about why are we voting? What do we think is positive about this? What, is the positive motivating things that can help kids feel secure? That's really part of that messaging, as opposed to things that might be scary, which we know is a much harder emotion for younger kids to process. So we got to balance their understanding of civics, but also their emotion processing skills. And we know young kids can get more easily scared. They don't realize this is a kind of indirect effects.
Hypothetically, let's say a listener hears this and they decide they want to open up a conversation about these elections with their child. How much should you let kids lead the conversation about politics? This can go to any of you guys, whoever wants to handle it. What are some of the first questions to ask, maybe to get the conversation started?
I think it's important in these kinds of conversations not to start with asking questions, but to really listen, because that's when we get to hear what the kids already know. Our children really know a lot more than we give them credit for, and we think that we've shielded them from things, but they are out in the world every day without us for a period of time, and they get information that we are unaware of. And so I think that when we're wanting to really understand their understanding of the political structure, the political climate of today, and what they think and feel about it, we have to start by listening and then inviting them to ask us questions and then asking them questions. Because if we start just with asking questions, then we will steer the conversation in the direction that we want it to go, but we may never get to the heart of their true understanding. And when we hear what they think, then we can help them to eradicate beliefs that are unfounded. And then we can also understand the fears and the thoughts and the misconceptions that they have, and really help to fill in gaps and all of that.
I completely agree with that. I think really starting with what are they wondering about? What are they curious about? It's very likely, as Christia mentioned, kids are able to really, start to have their own views. And Markeisha as well has mentioned that from a younger age. And so like and just to give an example for my own kids, I really have just been trying. I mean, I think, and this is what I recommend to parents and what we know, again, from the research is, really be that line of communication, like keep it really open. Do they have weird worries or fears or concerns? Are there things they're excited about? Because they also take note, of issues of representation. Like they will notice things about candidates, for example, that you're talking about in terms of their different identities, et cetera. And so really from the perspective of the youth, it's the more you help them just kind of figure out how to think about the things that they're curious about, but really, like has been said, with an open heart, kind of an open mind, even like and if there are things that they're hearing, for example, in the news, there are kind of two different sources that you'll probably, would be raising questions for kids that they may have a hard time articulating. One is that they'll hear it from other kids at school. So kids at school are talking about politics in a kid way, right? Like in their way. And so if there are things that are coming up in the news, or different, states have different laws that are being passed, et cetera, or your state has something that's being kind of considered, right, at this election, you can ask them if it doesn't come up organically. You can also ask them if anybody has talked about this at school, because that can open up conversation where there might be maybe more of a reluctance because they don't know exactly how to start that conversation. But you can also just come, have them really come to you if they hear something and they overhear something that you're talking about, or they see something on the news, on social media, if they're old enough to engage, or if they're somehow, just indirectly exposed to it, or as Christia said, at the kitchen table, just really keeping that line open is very, very critical.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We've been having a great conversation on politics, civics, and community. Coming up, what do we say to kids when politics turn ugly? Join the conversation. You're in The Wheelhouse. You're listening to Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse. From Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Frankie Graziano. We're learning how to talk about politics with the children in our lives. Still with us, Dr. Christia Spears-Brown of the University of Kentucky, Dr. Deborah Rivas-Drake from the University of Michigan, and Clark Atlanta University's Dr. Rakisha L. Fry-Brown. Christia, you've studied how children develop gender stereotypes and sort of how adults can effectively intervene. I'm sure many parents have been asked, haven't we ever had a woman president? Is that a question you heard during your studies? And how can adults respond to something like that?
I mean, that is definitely something we do research on and we hear a lot in our studies. And so, one thing I think is important to know is that kids do notice that there have been no, as they would say, girls as presidents. And what's been really concerning, though, is, we've been talking a little bit about talking about things in kid-friendly ways. Here's an example where kids see what's going on. They see that there have not been any women who have been president, but they often don't understand why. And it's often because we're not really talking about it. So we see about a third of girls think it's against the law for women to be president. And that makes sense if you think about it from a kid's perspective, in that, it looks like that somebody made a rule that no girls can be president because we've never had one. And for a kid who lives in a rule-based world, that's kind of a logical answer. And so we find that it's really helpful to talk to kids about why. And part of it is that, it used to be against the rules, it used to be against the law. And now kind of pointing out who are women who have been, who have run for president, who are women that are in politics at the local level, who might be in our either state Senate or in the Congress at the federal level. So pointing to other examples and helping kids understand that we hope to one day have lots of different types of presidents that look like the rest of the people that live in the U.S. And that although it was against the law before, now it's just a matter of more and more people needing to vote and knowing that all of us could make a good president regardless of our gender or our ethnicity.
And then when we're talking about whether or not we can have potentially the study that you're having, you talked about a third of girls saying this. What age were we talking about?
Elementary school. So we see a lot of kids know a lot about politics. So, we did a study right around the 2016 election, and, 90% of kids knew something about the candidates. And these are elementary school kids from about ages 5 to 10. But what they know is often really skewed through a child lens. So it's like a little bit accurate and quite a bit inaccurate. And so that's why, one of the reasons we often encourage parents to talk with their kids early, because kids are noticing, for example, that all the presidents have been men, but don't fully understand why. And we're it's pretty concerning when you hear what kids are thinking when it goes through the kid filter.
Rakisha, children are learning about race from an early age, and I can remember some of the language former President Donald Trump used to describe the COVID-19 virus, especially hateful towards Asian Americans, for example. If our children overhear that kind of language on TV, or even maybe kids repeat it at school, how can the adults in their lives help them unpack those words and their impact?
I think it's important to one note that it's not an if. Our children are hearing these things. They are hearing them. They're hearing them be on television. They're hearing them in ads. There was a time when children-specific programming did not have political ads targeted at it. And at this point, ads are fair game for everyone. And so the children are hearing these words. They're hearing this be repeated in spaces that they are in. And so we have to acknowledge that try as we might to protect them, that we cannot. And sometimes we are doing more of a disservice by pretending that they don't have access to the information than we would be by engaging them in their understanding about that information. So that's the first part. The second part of that is when they are being faced with this information and trying to make sense of it and digest it for themselves, we have to make sure that we are giving them a clear space and a free, open space to be able to ask their questions. So a lot of the words that they're hearing are no words, right? They're words that children are not supposed to say. And so if they can't come to you and ask what this is without fear of retribution or punishment for saying these inappropriate words, we have to give them the space to be able to ask questions about what it is that they're hearing and then unpack what that means and why it's inappropriate, not just that it is inappropriate. So what does this mean? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to the friends that you have, to the people around you, to the people that you know or come in contact with? And why wouldn't you want to say those things about other people? How would it feel if someone was saying things like that to you or about you? And so really making the words be personal and adding humanity to the statements that are being thrown around in the political arena right now, so that children understand that words do hurt. They can hurt. And we have to be careful with the words that we say and the words that we repeat, even if they were not our own thoughts.
Does your or your child's racial or ethnic background matter in terms of how we talk about this?
I absolutely think it does. I don't think that there's a way to tease out race in a racially motivated and racially driven society. So we know that race is a social construct, but we also know that race is a very important construct in American culture. And so because of that, a child's understanding of their race and where their race stands and what it means for and to their race, for different policies to be enacted or to be disbarred or disbanded, what it means and how it could and does impact them as they move throughout their days. I think we have to shine the light on it, and we can't run away from those types of conversations.
I want to open this up to everybody. Just jump in if you got some tips for me here. What tips do you have for parents who want to teach their children to identify racist language or behavior, call it out, stand up for the person or persons being targeted, or just how to address it in general?
I think that every time we hear it, whether it be on the radio, whether it be a television show, whether we hear a kid repeat it, is a learning moment. So I think that, I think, to reiterate what Rakisha was saying is, it very much differs based on the race of the parent and the child. I'll say that I'm a white parent of two white kids, and I have to be very aware of things that my kids might be repeating as white kids. And I have to really help them develop kind of anti-racist language, so that if they say, oh, some kid said this, I have to really help my kids know how can they speak up when they hear someone say that? What can they say in response? So we've even, done kind of a role play of, if someone says this, what can you say back? Because I need my kids to be upstanders and to say something in response, because that's what they have to do, and not be a passive kind of listener and passive audience to some of this. And I think all kids are going to hear this. We know that kids in school, by the time they're in elementary school, are overhearing racist language. There's a lot of racial and ethnic discrimination that goes on among kids. And so we have to know that our kids are going to hear this. It doesn't matter what kind of great school they go to, they're going to hear other kids repeating things. And so we have to prepare kids for, what are you going to do when you hear this? And so we would have like very concrete conversations. And often it is when kids say, somebody said this, and then we have to pause and we have to talk about it for a few minutes. It doesn't need to be an hour-long lecture, but it does need to be let's spend a couple of minutes processing what you need to do when that happens.
Deborah, ideally, we teach the children in our lives to be fair and kind to everyone. Treat everyone how you want to be treated, right? But how do we explain to them why the people holding the most powerful positions in the country don't always behave that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, I wish
I put it all on you there, Deborah.
I'm sorry. Oh, I wish I could had a good answer or good enough answer for them and for myself, because it is deeply unfair. It's very hard for them to, once they're able to recognize hypocrisy, for example, cognitively, like understand that people in power don't follow the same rules that they're expected to follow in school. And I, as an adult, am expected to follow in a workplace, for example. So the behaviors sometimes that you will see are just would be completely unacceptable and should not be acceptable in any setting, but they're definitely not acceptable. They go against the things that we teach our kids, in terms of what should be expectations for their own behavior in schools and the community and family, and for myself, even, as an adult in the settings that I'm a part of. And I think the main thing that I would say about this is that they need to be reminded every time that that it comes up, right? That they don't have to accept such behavior. It's similar to what Christia was saying about being an upstander, that even if other people behave this way, this is not a model for you. Like you should not, accept such behavior as normal. You shouldn't normalize it or rationalize it or try to excuse it in any way. It is what it is. It is problematic, behavior, and that's what it should be, recognized as. And I think being honest about how, this is a difficult conversation to have, with very young kids, but about how sometimes, maybe with your adolescent kids, about how sometimes power does shield folks from being held to account, for problematic behavior or from consequences. And that what are the systems that we work within to try to have that accountability, and that they're imperfect systems, even though we have them, they don't always yield, right, like the best outcome, like the outcome that we want to see. Sometimes people do get away with this bad behavior, and it's very much a problem. Yeah. And I guess I would say being honest about it and understanding, what are the systems, and then also what are the limitations of the systems that we have to hold our politicians accountable for their bad behavior.
I think that when we talk about those systems, I think it's important that these are important times to really get kids to understand the full extent of the political structure, right? That the president is not the only person that makes decisions, and that's not the only election that we should be voting in. And so when we talk about the modeling of voter behaviors and all of those kinds of things for children in an election cycle, we want to take kids to the local elections, to the state elections, to the elections that are happening on smaller scales as well, because the decisions to propel or to highlight negative behavior happen in smaller rooms and on a smaller scale. And so we also have to show kids that we can be held accountable, even personally, by making sure that we are showing up in the spaces where the decisions are actually being made when we have the opportunity, but also then relaying those back to their own school and classroom activities. So when you are voting for the student council president, we don't want to just be voting for someone who's popular. We want to be voting for someone who has good character, and that showing how those things are important on even the school level, just like they're important on the political presidential level. And so we want to make sure that we are giving them the space to see that this permeates our way of being. It is not just something that happens every 4 years. It's something that happens routinely and continuously throughout our lives, and that we have a voice and a responsibility to try to stop these things from happening.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You're listening to our conversation on politics and talking about it with kids. After a short break, more listener questions for the experts. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're unpacking how to talk to children about politics and the upcoming election. I've been talking to Dr. Christia Spears-Brown, Dr. Deborah Rivas-Drake, and Dr. Rakisha L. Fry-Brown. And now I'm also joined by an incredible local guest with me now, Dr. Melissa Santos, Division Head of Pediatric Psychology at Connecticut Children's. Melissa, I'm going to start off this part of the conversation with you. We did a call out on social media asking for adults to share some of the tricky questions children have asked them about the election. Someone responded that a kid asked them, is Congress going to support LGBTQ plus rights? This question made me think, what should we do when we don't know the answer to a question, or maybe there's some uncertainty around a question?
So it's such a great question, because I think oftentimes we get hesitant to talk to kids about things because we always want to have the right answer. And I think it's a great opportunity to talk to kids about, mom, dad, trusted adult, I don't know the answer to this, or I don't know what's going to happen. And really thinking about talking to kids about what you can do to feel safe and secure, taking that time to listen, sharing with them what you're feeling. I think oftentimes we hesitate to model or talk to kids about our own feelings, and really creating a routine to keep the conversation going and letting kids learn to sit a little bit with uncertainty, and letting us also learn to sit with uncertainty in this time are great skills to start to teach our kids.
To piggyback off of that too, I think it is a great thing to talk to kids about. I don't really know. And to help kids figure out, well, what's a way we could maybe look this up? What's a way we could seek out information? What can we do to help ourselves better understand this? I think talking to kids about the process of how do we become informed, how do we learn about who the candidates are, and coming at it with kids as kind of a partnership in a way where you're really providing some scaffolding to kids of, I don't really know. Let's go look this up. Let's go read something about this together.
Melissa, we know that kids are constantly learning how to process big feelings, and right now the state of our country and our democracy can really feel a little bit scary. Do you have any advice for parents or caretakers of kids who struggle with anxiety when it comes to political talks?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that we can do to kind of help minimize. I think we know that anxiety is a common feeling that we all have, and the goal of anxiety and talking about how we help with anxiety is never to get rid of anxiety, because we all have it. But I think taking that time to have those conversations with kids, modeling for kids how we as trusted adults manage anxiety. So even I think it's very powerful for kids to hear their trusted adult in their world say, you know what, I'm having a lot of tummy rumblings and I think my heart's racing a little bit. So I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to do some deep breathing because that helps me. Do you want to join me? I think really helps to model for kids how we manage those big feelings and, about the politics or really about anything, and really starts to set them to have that toolkit that we oftentimes talk about them having to manage big feelings that could come in for them.
You just touched on this a little bit, but is it okay to let kids know when we're feeling sad or upset over politics?
I think it's okay to let kids know when we're feeling sad about anything. I think we are very good as trusted adults to talk to kids about, the importance of things like, brushing your teeth and eating healthy and physical activity, but we don't oftentimes do that when it comes to feelings. I think we're scared we're going to put things in kids' heads. And I think it's really powerful for trusted adults, parents, grown-ups to talk to kids about their feelings and what they're doing to take care of their feelings so that kids start to have examples of being able to label feelings, understand that it's normal to have feelings, and understand some of the things that they can do to help with those feelings.
Can I just jump in? And I just wanted to say that I agree with that. I also think that it's really important to be honest about those emotions that go along with these very important decisions, right, that are being made, and how, as adults, we sort of figure out a way not to completely disengage from the process, right? So we're still going out and using our voice in whatever, form makes sense for us. It could be, I am really upset about this situation, or I have fear that, this policy would, or this kind of election could lead to a situation where people that I care about are going to experience harm, or they're going to be unsafe, or people in my own family, right, will be unsafe. And just acknowledge, I think it's important to acknowledge that, but then also to talk about how you are working through it to remain engaged in this process in ways that seem generative. It could be resisting, right? It could be attending a rally, it could be attending a demonstration, something like that, engaging more in activism. That is a way to also use your voice to say, I am not okay with this, with this potential outcome, and I'm not okay with people that I care about being harmed through this process. So I think there's a lot of ways that your emotion, right, it also can spur action. And I think talking through that is important with kids as well.
Let's say we have child X here and they're really invested in the race for president, just to throw that out or whatever. Maybe they're dealing with it acutely after there's a result or something like that. But how do we help them prepare for the possibility that their candidate might not win? Or do we deal with it, I guess, more acutely, if that makes sense?
I mean, I think that's part of talking about what elections are that sometimes, our person wins and sometimes the other person wins. And that's part of it. And that whichever happens, I think, one thing we learned in our research from 2016 is that a lot of kids were really scared after the election. And so for kids, particularly kids of, for example, immigrants, were particularly worried that their parents would be deported. And so I think being able to help kids, though, process if they're in a group where they're feeling really scared, helping them process that fear, but also recognizing that, that's part of what elections are, is that someone's going to win and someone's not, but that as a family, we'll figure out how that we're going to be okay.
Christy hit it on the head that we have to talk to them about the fact that someone will win and someone will lose. And we cannot sugarcoat the fact that there will be consequences on either side. And consequences are not always bad. There are repercussions regardless. And we always think about consequences in a negative connotation, but that either way, there will be something that comes from it. I think when we are having these discussions, that we have to think and remember that oftentimes we shield our children from our feelings, and then they don't understand how to process feelings because we've never shown them how to process feelings. And so when Deborah mentioned before, we don't need to make things up. We can say that we don't know, but we can also say that we have thoughts and feelings, that we are afraid, or that we have, concerns about things that are happening or what may potentially happen. And Christy again hit it on the head by saying that, but my responsibility as your parent is to make sure that you are okay, that you are safe, in as much as I have the ability to do that, regardless of what the outcome is. And so I think that in such an unstable, uncertain time and type of scenario, we just need to be honest with them, but give them the space to see us being honest with ourselves as well.
As the show comes to a close here, we're going to zoom all the way out. Why does this matter, guys? How are the conversations we're having with children now shaping the kinds of people they'll be in the future? Maybe we start with you, Melissa, here. Go ahead.
I think this is a great opportunity to really talk to kids about big feelings. And I think, as we've talked about before, sometimes we struggle in terms of talking to kids about big feelings, allowing them to own it, allowing them to see our big feelings. And I think this provides a great opportunity to start to teach kids and model for them how we handle adversity, how we come together as a family, how we stay true to our values and our commitment as a family for what we feel like is important, and how we continue to move that forward, regardless of what happens in the political elections and moving forward.
It matters a lot. It matters a lot. I think teaching them to participate in and identify their own local spheres of influence, like I've said before, in their family, in the classroom, in the school, in their community more broadly. It's really, really an important habit of mind, and to understand what kind of influence they can have and how to use their voice in those spheres of influence is really critical to start at as early an age as possible. And it's important to understand that they have agency and they can use their voice to make the world better right now, to make their world better right now, in ways that are important, not just for their own lives, for other people they might care about. And all of this in the long term really is a kind of, their development of an understanding of how to be an informed, engaged participant in this democracy. And part of this is really helping us to preserve, our democracy, is by having folks who can be thoughtful about how they're using their voice and why they're using their voice in particular ways.
I think this matters because we have to acknowledge that information is at a premium. Children have information at their fingertips constantly. We all do. We have these phones that can take us to the information superhighway with a click of a button. And because of that, we are being bombarded with sights and sounds and feelings and perspectives and opinions constantly. And just as we as adults might feel overwhelmed and have to process that and decide where we stand on issues, children do as well. And so these conversations are imperative because children are not exempt from the exposure. They're not exempt from the impacts. They're not exempt from what will happen, even though they are not yet old enough to vote. They will still be impacted by what happens with the vote. And so we have to give them the space to have a bit of autonomy when it comes to their own understanding and their own acceptance of what we're doing. So these conversations are important because they matter just by virtue of the fact that we are dealing with children in this country who will be impacted by the decisions of this country.
I was just going to make a quick point that there's also a lot of research that's been done 20, 30 years ago that shows that how kids have these conversations with their parents when they're young actually predicts their attitudes later on. So there is some evidence that shows over time these messages stick. Kind of these big elections, like presidential elections, have trickle down effects for the rest of people's voting lives.
Last question here. Anybody feel free to jump in. Have you seen or read any resources that our audience could take advantage of, whether it be like TV shows for kids or books that address politics, especially helpful in engaging them on this topic? Give us a resource here if you can, guys.
I'll say there's one great one that I love. It's called Grace for President. It's really for kind of elementary school kids. It does a great job of explaining the Electoral College in a very school age friendly way. It's about a school presidential thing, but it's actually really informative and really helped my kids when they were in elementary school understand the complexity of states votes versus federal votes. So my completely unbiased plug for that book, Grace for President.
I'm going all the way old school with Schoolhouse Rocks. My mom used those videos that she used when she was young. Well, they weren't videos, but she used those songs to teach me. That's how I learned the preamble and learned about a bill and how it goes through.
I was going to say how a bill becomes the law, right?
Yep, exactly. And I think, with YouTube, you can take kids back if you can get their attention once they have the interest. Sometimes music, setting something to a tune is really helpful as well. But I still remember, and I never watched Schoolhouse Rocks, but my mom saw it and she taught it to me and I've taught it to my son. And so I think sometimes we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can use some things that are already tried and true.
Thank you so much to our experts for joining today's show on such an important topic. This was a fun one. Today's show was produced by Chloe Wynn. It was edited by Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. The executive producer of The Wheelhouse is my boss, Katie Tolarski. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.